The candle flames shook first. Then the whole room seemed to hold its breath as Lord Cedric Ashworth's voice cracked across the wedding hall like a whip. "You clumsy, worthless girl, do you know how much this gown cost? Do you know who I am?" Elena Marsh froze on her knees at the center of Thornleigh Hall's grand marble floor, a needle still pinched between her fingers, a small tear in the hem of the wedding dress only half repaired. 200 guests in silk and jewels turned to stare. Somewhere behind her, a string quartet stumbled mid-note and fell silent, unsure whether to keep playing through the sudden storm. She had been called in only that morning, a last-minute favor for the seamstress who normally handled the Ashworth family's affairs, but who had fallen ill with a fever the night before. Elena ran a small shop 2 streets from the harbor, mending coats and hemming skirts for merchants' wives, women who thanked her with a warm cup of tea and a fair coin. She had never in her life stood inside a house as grand as this one. She had certainly never expected to be shouted at in front of a crowd that could have bought her entire street twice over. "I am sorry, my lord," she said, her voice steady even though her hands were not. The tear was deeper than it looked. "I am almost finished." "Almost finished," Cedric repeated, mocking her plain accent with a curl of his lip. He was a tall man, handsome in the practiced way of someone who had spent a lifetime being told he was handsome, with pale gold hair combed back and eyes the color of frost on a window. His bride, Sophia Vane, stood a few feet away in white silk and diamonds, her face carefully composed into the polite blankness of a woman who had learned long ago not to argue with him in public. "My wedding begins in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, and this cost me nothing. You will replace that dress from your own pocket if it is not perfect." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the nearest guests, the kind of laughter that came easily to people who had never once worried about the cost of anything. Elena felt her face burn, not from shame exactly, but from the particular sting of being made small in front of strangers who would forget her by supper and never think of her again. "It will be perfect," she said quietly and bent back to her work because there was nothing else to do. Her father had taught her that. Keep your hands steady even when your chest is not. But Cedric was not finished. He reached down and gripped her wrist, hard enough that the needle slipped and pricked her finger, a small bead of blood welling against the white silk of the gown. "Look at me when I am speaking to you," he snapped, and there was something in his grip, something ugly and possessive, that made several of the older guests exchange uneasy glances, the kind of glance that says a man has shown his true face for half a second too long. "Cedric," Sophia said softly, stepping forward, "please, people are watching." "Stay out of this," he said, without even turning his head, and his fingers tightened further around Elena's thin wrist. It was at that exact moment that the great oak doors at the far end of the hall opened without warning, swinging wide enough that the cold afternoon air rushed in and made every candle flame lean sideways at once. A hush fell first among the guests nearest the door, then spread backward through the crowd like a wave rolling toward shore, until even the musicians, who had begun playing again in a nervous attempt to smooth over the awkwardness, let their instruments fall silent mid-note. A man stood in the doorway. He wore no wedding finery, only a long dark coat still damp from travel, as though he had ridden hard and fast to arrive at exactly this moment. He was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a stillness about him that commanded attention more thoroughly than any shout could have. Elena did not know his face, but she felt the air in the room change the instant he stepped inside, the way the sky changes color just before a storm breaks. "Leave her alone," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried through the enormous hall with the effortless weight of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, and every single person in that room, from the highest lord to the lowest servant standing against the wall, went utterly silent. Cedric's grip on Elena's wrist loosened, then dropped entirely, as if her arm had suddenly turned to fire in his hand. He turned toward the doorway, and for the first time since Elena had arrived that morning, she saw something other than arrogance cross his face. She saw fear. "Alexander," Cedric said, and his voice had lost its cutting edge, replaced by something thinner, more careful. "I did not know you were coming." Clearly, the man in the doorway said, walking forward now, his boots striking the marble with slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the silent hall. Guests parted before him without being asked, the way a crowd parts for whether it does not wish to be caught in. I was told there would be a wedding today. I was not told there would be a public humiliation as the opening entertainment. Whispers began to spread through the crowd, quiet and urgent, guest leaning toward guest. Alina caught fragments of it even as she knelt frozen on the floor, her wrist still throbbing where Cedric had gripped it. The Duke. That is the Duke of Thornleigh. I did not know he still came to family events. I thought he never left his estate anymore, not since the fire. Is that the same Duke? The one who disappeared from society for 3 years? The man called Alexander stopped a few feet from where Alina knelt, and for a moment he looked down at her, not with pity, which she would have hated, but with something quieter and more careful, an attention that made her feel, oddly, less like a spectacle and more like a person again. Then he offered her his hand. "You are not obligated to finish this dress on your knees while being shouted at," he said, and though the words were meant for her, his eyes stayed on Cedric the entire time, cold and unblinking. "Stand up." Alina hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was firm but careful, nothing like the bruising grasp Cedric had used moments before, and he helped her to her feet with an ease that suggested he had done this sort of thing before, steadying someone who had been knocked off balance by another person's cruelty. "This is a family matter," Cedric said, some of his old confidence returning now that the initial shock had passed, though his voice still shook slightly at the edges. "I do not see how it concerns you, cousin. You were not even invited." "I am aware I was not invited," Alexander said. "I came anyway because someone thought it wise to warn me what kind of man you have become since I last saw you." It seems they were not exaggerating. He glanced around the silent hall, at the 200 guests who stood frozen mid-conversation, mid-breath, watching the confrontation unfold with the particular hunger of people who knew they were witnessing a scandal that would be spoken of for months. Perhaps everyone here should know exactly what kind of husband Sophia Vane is about to marry. "Do not," Cedric said quickly, and for the first time there was real panic beneath his anger. "Do not do this here." "Then you should not have done what you did here," Alexander replied evenly. "I did not create this scene, Cedric. I only stepped into the middle of it." Sophia Vane, who had stood silent and pale through the entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice small but clear in the enormous quiet of the hall. "Is it true," she asked, looking not at Cedric but at Alexander, "what people say about him? About the housemaid last spring and the groundskeeper's daughter the year before that?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples of it moved outward through the crowd in a fresh wave of whispers. Cedric's face went the color of old ash. "That is a lie," he said, too quickly, too loudly, the kind of denial that convinces no one. "Sophia, you cannot believe the gossip of servants." "I did not believe it," Sophia said quietly, "until today. Until I watched you grab a young woman hard enough to draw blood in front of 200 people over a dress." Her eyes were bright, but her chin was lifted, and Alina thought, watching her, that this must be a woman who had spent a very long time learning how not to cry in public. "I think perhaps I have believed a great many convenient lies about you, my lord, because it was easier than admitting the truth." "You will not embarrass me in my own wedding hall," Cedric said, his voice rising again, though it cracked this time, the sound of a man who felt control slipping through his fingers and did not know how to stop it. He turned toward Alexander with something close to desperation. "This is your doing. You always did enjoy ruining things that were not yours to touch." "I did not force your hand around her wrist," Alexander said, nodding slightly toward Alina, who still stood beside him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the nearest guests could hear it. "I did not tell you to humiliate her in front of your entire family and half of London's finest houses. You did that yourself, cousin, quite thoroughly, without any help from me." A murmur of agreement moved through parts of the crowd, quiet but unmistakable, the sound of a room slowly turning against a man who had, until moments ago, held every advantage in it. An older woman near the front, dressed in deep burgundy and wearing the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, stepped forward with a sharp click of her cane against the marble floor. "I believe," she said, her voice carrying easily through the hall, "that this wedding is no longer taking place today." It was Lady Constance Ashworth, Cedric's own aunt, and the words seemed to settle the matter more finally than anything else that had been said. Cedric opened his mouth to protest, looked around at the sea of faces no longer looking at him with admiration but with something closer to disgust, and closed it again. Sophia removed the diamond ring from her finger with slow, deliberate care, as though she wanted every person in the room to witness the exact moment she set it down on the small table beside her, among the discarded needle and thread Alina had brought that morning. "I think that is wise," she said. "Thank you, Aunt Constance." The hall exploded into a low roar of conversation, 200 guests suddenly finding a great deal to say to one another. And in the chaos of it, Alina felt Alexander's hand settle gently at her elbow, guiding her a few steps back from the center of the room, away from the eyes that had begun, gradually, to turn toward her instead of Cedric. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, nodding toward her wrist, where a faint red mark was already beginning to bloom against her pale skin. "I will be fine," she said, though her voice trembled slightly now that the immediate danger had passed and the full strangeness of the moment was beginning to settle over her. "Thank you. I do not know why you did that, but thank you." Something crossed his face then, quick and complicated, gone before she could name it. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "No one should have to kneel and be shouted at simply for trying to do their work well." He glanced once more at the wedding dress, still draped over Alina's abandoned sewing basket, the small tear now permanently unfinished, a symbol, perhaps, of a wedding that would never take place. "Come. I think it is best if we are both away from here before the questions start." But the questions had already started. Alina could feel them in the eyes that followed her and the Duke as he led her toward a side door away from the main hall, whispers rising behind them like smoke. Who is she? Why did he defend a seamstress in front of the entire wedding party? Has the Duke of Thornleigh finally returned to society, and if so, why for her? Alina did not know the answers to any of those questions. She only knew that an hour ago she had been an ordinary woman with an ordinary needle and thread, and now she was walking beside a duke through a hallway lined with portraits of his ancestors, her wrists still aching, her mind spinning, utterly certain that whatever had just happened in that wedding hall, her quiet, unremarkable life had changed in ways she could not yet begin to understand. Behind them, the wedding hall remained in an uproar, the sound of raised voices and scattered gossip following them like a current, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Cedric Ashworth stood alone at the altar that would never see a wedding, his face twisted with a fury that had not yet found its target, but would, soon enough. And Alina Marsh, walking quickly to keep pace with a duke she had met only minutes before, had no way of knowing that his anger would eventually find its way back to her. The side hallway was quiet compared to the roar behind them, but Alina could still hear it, a distant storm of voices rising and falling through the thick oak doors. Alexander led her past a row of tall windows overlooking a garden gone gray with early winter, and finally into a small study lined with books, where a fire had already been lit against the afternoon chill. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "You look as though you might fall down if you do not." Alina sat, mostly because her legs had begun to shake now that the danger had passed, and there was nothing left to keep her upright but habit. She looked down at her wrist, at the faint bruise already darkening beneath her sleeve, and pressed her other hand over it without quite meaning to. "I should go," she said, though she made no move to stand. "I have caused enough trouble for one afternoon." "You caused nothing," Alexander said, his voice firm but not unkind. He crossed to a small cabinet, poured a measure of something amber into a glass, and set it on the table beside her without asking whether she wanted it, the way one might offer a blanket to someone who had been standing too long in the cold. "Cedric caused this. I would rather you did not carry guilt that belongs to someone else." Alina wrapped her fingers around the glass but did not drink. "You called him cousin," she said, Is that true? He is family to you. Distantly, Alexander said, settling into the chair opposite her. In the firelight she could see him more clearly now than she had in the chaos of the hall, the sharp line of his jaw, the tired shadows beneath his eyes that suggested a man who did not sleep easily, and a scar along his left hand that looked old and pale, the kind of mark that had been there many years. His father and mine were brothers. We were raised in different houses, but we saw each other at family gatherings often enough when we were young. I have not seen him in nearly 4 years. And yet you came today, Alina said, uninvited. Something in his expression tightened, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he said quietly, I had a reason. It is not a simple one. You do not owe me an explanation, she said, though curiosity pulled at her all the same. You already did more than most men would have. I am grateful, truly. But I do not understand why a duke would risk his own reputation to defend a seamstress he has never met. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though the answer lived somewhere in the flames. What is your name? He asked finally. I realize I never asked. Alina, she said, Alina Marsh. Something shifted behind his eyes at the sound of her name, subtle but unmistakable, the way a man's face changes when a familiar word is spoken in an unfamiliar place. Marsh, he repeated softly. Your father. Was his name William Marsh? Alina's breath caught. How do you know that? Alexander set down his own glass, untouched, and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze steady on hers in a way that made her feel, for the first time since she had entered Thornleigh Hall that morning, entirely seen. Because 11 years ago your father saved my life, he said, and I have spent every year since trying to find a way to repay a debt I was never certain I could repay. The words settled over Alina like a weight she had not been prepared to carry. My father never spoke of any duke, she said slowly. He spoke of a fire once a long time ago. He said very little about it. He carried the scars on his hands until the day he died, but he never told me how he got them, only that it was an old accident and not worth discussing. It was not an accident that he survived it, Alexander said. It was a fire in the east wing of this very house, when I was 18 years old and foolish enough to run back into a burning building to save a set of papers I believed, at the time, mattered more than my own life. Your father was working as a carpenter's assistant here that summer, repairing the stable roof. He saw the smoke before anyone else did. He ran in after me when the beams were already falling, and he carried me out through a wall of fire that should have killed us both. He turned his hand over, revealing the pale scar along his palm more fully in the firelight. This is what I carried out of it. Your father carried far worse. His hands were burned so badly he could not properly hold a hammer again for over a year. I offered him money, a position, anything he wanted, and he refused all of it. He said he had only done what any decent man would do, and he wanted nothing for it. Alina sat very still, the glass forgotten in her hands, memories rearranging themselves in her mind like furniture in a room she thought she had known well. She remembered her father's hands, the rough scarred skin along his palms and fingers that she had never once thought to question as a child. Because to a child, a father's hands are simply a father's hands, weathered and strong, not a map of a night he never spoke of. He died 3 years ago, she said quietly. A fever in the winter. He never mentioned any of this. I know he died, Alexander said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, just enough for Alina to hear the years of guilt beneath the careful composure. I have known where you lived for some time, Alina. I have watched from a distance to be certain you were provided for, that your shop had enough business to keep you fed and warm. I never approached you directly, because your father made it very clear before he passed that he did not want charity extended to his daughter simply because of what happened in that fire. He said you were capable of building your own life, and that if I truly wished to honor what he had done, I should let you do exactly that. You have been watching me, Alina said, not quite an accusation, but not entirely comfortable either, a strange mixture of gratitude and unease settling in her chest. Watching is perhaps too strong a word, Alexander said. I made certain, through people who never mentioned my name, that you were never turned away from fair work, and that no landlord ever raised your rent unfairly, and that was the extent of it. I did not seek you out. I did not intend to see you today either. I only learned last night, from a groundskeeper who still remembers your father fondly, that Cedric's wedding seamstress had fallen ill, and that a young woman from the harbor district had been sent for in her place. When I heard your name mentioned, I could not stay away, because I remembered exactly what your father's name meant to me, and I did not trust Cedric to treat any hired worker with basic decency, let alone the daughter of the man who saved my life. Alina finally drank from the glass, the warmth of it settling low in her chest, giving her something to hold on to besides the strange spinning sensation of learning her entire understanding of her father's past was incomplete. I do not know what to say to any of this, she admitted. An hour ago I thought I would spend today mending a hem and returning home to a quiet evening. Now I am sitting in a duke's study, learning that my father was a hero I never knew about, and that a stranger has been quietly watching over my life for years. I am sorry, Alexander said. I did not intend to overwhelm you. I only meant to help you today, not to unravel your entire history in a single afternoon. You did not do the unraveling, Alina said, echoing his own words back to him with the faintest hint of a smile, though it did not quite reach her eyes yet. Cedric began that. You simply told me the truth I did not know I was missing. A knock sounded at the study door before he could respond, and a servant entered, bowing quickly. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. Lady Constance requests your presence. The guests are demanding answers, and Lord Cedric has left the hall in a temper. Several are asking whether you intend to make a statement. Alexander sighed, the sound of a man being pulled reluctantly back into a world he clearly would have preferred to avoid. Tell them I will be along shortly, he said, and the servant bowed again and withdrew. You should go, Alina said, rising from her chair, though her legs still felt unsteady beneath her. I have taken enough of your time, and it sounds as though you are needed. Alina, Alexander said, standing as well, and something in the way he said her name, careful and deliberate, made her pause. I do not say this to frighten you, but I think you should understand what today has set into motion. By tomorrow morning, all of London will be speaking of what happened in that hall. They will speak of Cedric's cruelty, yes, but they will also speak of a duke defending an unknown seamstress in front of 200 witnesses, and people will invent whatever story pleases them most to explain it. Some of those stories may not be kind to you. I am not afraid of gossip, Alina said, though even as she spoke the words, a small knot of worry had already begun to form in her stomach, because she knew, of course, that gossip from the wealthy could reach further and do more damage than gossip from the harbor district ever could. A ruined reputation among fishmongers' wives meant losing a few customers. A ruined reputation invented by 200 aristocrats could mean something far worse, something she did not yet have the imagination to fully picture. You should be a little afraid, Alexander said gently. Not because you did anything wrong, but because people with too much money and too little to occupy their minds can be cruel in ways that have nothing to do with truth. I intend to protect you from as much of that as I am able, but I wanted you to walk out of this house today with your eyes open, not surprised later by what you find waiting for you. Alina studied him for a long moment, this quiet, serious man who had walked into a wedding uninvited and appended the entire event with 3 words, who carried a decade-old debt to her father like a stone in his chest, who seemed, despite his title and his cold reputation among strangers, genuinely more concerned with her well-being than his own standing. Thank you for the warning, she said finally. And thank you again for today, whatever comes of it. Allow me to have my carriage take you home, he said. It is the least I can do, and I would rather know you arrived safely than imagine you walking back through the harbor district alone after everything that has happened today. Alina hesitated, aware of how strange it would look, a duke's carriage rattling down her narrow street, aware too of how quickly her small, ordinary life seemed to be tangling itself with a much larger and more complicated one. But her wrist still ached, and the afternoon light was already beginning to fade toward evening, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not want to refuse him. "Thank you," she said. "I would appreciate that." He walked her to the carriage himself, past servants who stared with poorly concealed curiosity, past a window through which Alina caught a glimpse of Sophia Vane sitting alone in a side parlor, no longer wearing the veil, staring out at the garden with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but something suspended between the two. As the carriage pulled away from Thornleigh Hall, Alina looked back once at the great house rising gray and enormous against the darkening sky, and thought of her father's scarred hands, and the fire he had never spoken of, and the strange new weight of a debt she had not known existed until an hour ago. She did not yet know that Cedric Ashworth, standing at a window on the second floor, watched the carriage disappear down the long drive with a fury that had finally found somewhere to settle, or that the story of what had happened in that wedding hall would, by morning, spread through every fashionable drawing-room in the city, twisted and reshaped by 100 different mouths, until the truth of it was almost unrecognizable, or that this quiet ride home in a duke's carriage was not the end of the day's strangeness, but only the very beginning of it. 11 years earlier, on a night Alexander Greystone had spent most of his adult life trying not to remember, the east wing of Thornleigh Hall had caught fire just after midnight. He had been 18 that summer, restless and proud in the way young men often are before life has had the chance to humble them properly. His father, the old duke, had been away in London on business, and Alexander had used the freedom of an empty house to stay up late in his study, working through a set of family papers he had convinced himself were desperately important, letters and ledgers concerning a dispute over land boundaries with a neighboring estate. He remembered now, looking back, how foolish it seemed, how little any of it had mattered in the end, and how close it had come to costing him everything. The fire had started in the kitchens, a spark from an untended hearth catching against dry linens left too near the flame, and by the time anyone noticed the smoke, it had already climbed through the walls and into the floor above, spreading along old timber that had not been replaced in decades. Alexander had smelled it first as a strange bitterness in the air, dismissed it, gone back to his papers, and only truly understood what was happening when a maid ran screaming down the corridor outside his study door, her nightdress smeared with soot, shouting that the east wing was burning. He should have run then. Every instinct told him to run, and for a moment he had, following the scrambling servants toward the main staircase and the cold night air outside. But halfway down the stairs, he had remembered the papers still sitting on his desk, papers that included, among other things, letters written by his late mother, whom he had lost only 2 years before, letters he could not bear the thought of losing to flame along with everything else. He had turned around. He had run back into a house that was rapidly becoming an inferno, up the stairs, through smoke so thick he could no longer see his own hands in front of him, and by the time he reached his study, the ceiling above the corridor had already begun to buckle. He remembered very little of what happened next with any clarity, only fragments, the heat pressing against his skin like something solid, the roar of the fire swallowing every other sound, a beam collapsing somewhere behind him and cutting off the path he had come from. He remembered falling, or being struck by something falling, and the papers he had risked everything for scattering uselessly across a floor that was already beginning to catch. And then through the smoke, a voice. William Marsh had been sleeping in the stable loft that night, hired for the summer to repair the roof, a quiet man in his 30s with rough hands, and a reputation among the staff for working harder and complaining less than anyone else on the grounds. He had seen the smoke through the loft window before the alarm bell had even finished ringing, and instead of running toward safety with the rest of the household, he had run toward the burning wing, because he had overheard a maid say the young master was still inside. Alexander did not remember exactly how William found him in that maze of smoke and collapsing beams, only that a pair of strong hands had gripped him beneath the arms and hauled him upright when his legs would no longer hold him, only that a voice, calm despite the chaos, had said, over and over, "We are nearly there, stay with me, we are nearly there." He remembered the wall of flame they had passed through to reach the servants' stairwell, remembered the searing pain along his own hand where he had reached out instinctively to steady himself against a burning doorframe, remembered William Marsh shielding him with his own body, as a section of ceiling gave way behind them, taking the worst of the falling debris across his back and hands so that Alexander would not have to. They had made it out. Barely. William Marsh had collapsed the moment they cleared the door. His hands burned so severely that the estate physician later said it was a miracle he would ever use them again at all, his back scarred from the fallen timber in ways that would ache every winter for the rest of his life. Alexander had escaped with only the scar along his palm, a small price compared to what William had paid, and yet it had taken him years to stop dreaming of that corridor, of the moment he had turned back for a handful of letters that, in the end, had burned anyway, lost to the fire despite William Marsh nearly dying to help him try to save them. His father, returning from London 3 days later, had been furious, not at Alexander for his foolishness, but at the household for allowing the fire to spread so far unchecked. He had offered William Marsh a considerable sum of money and a permanent position on the estate staff, an offer William had quietly, firmly declined. Alexander had never forgotten the conversation he overheard between his father and William, standing just outside the physician's room where William's hands were being bandaged for the second time that week. "I do not want your money, my lord," William had said, his voice rough with pain but steady all the same. "I did what any man would have done for another man's son. If you wish to thank me, look after my daughter someday if I am ever not able to. That is worth more to me than any coin you could offer." At the time, Alexander had been too young, too consumed by his own guilt and grief, to understand the full weight of what William Marsh had asked of him. It was only years later, after his father had passed and the title had fallen to Alexander himself, after he had made quiet, careful inquiries, and learned that William Marsh had married, had a daughter, had eventually died from a fever that his fire-damaged lungs never fully recovered from, that Alexander understood exactly what debt he still carried, and exactly whom it was owed to. He had watched over Alina from a distance for 3 years since her father's death, the way one might tend a garden without ever stepping inside it, careful never to let his help be traced back to him, mindful always of William's wish that his daughter build her own life rather than live inside the shadow of a debt she had never asked to be part of. He had told himself more than once that this was enough, that quiet, distant protection honored William's memory sufficiently, that he owed Alina nothing more direct than that. And then he had heard her name spoken carelessly by a groundskeeper the night before Cedric's wedding, had learned she would be inside Thornleigh Hall the very next day, working for a man Alexander already knew, through years of family gossip and his own uneasy instincts, to be capable of real cruelty. He had told himself he was only going to observe from a distance, to be certain she was treated fairly and nothing more. He had not expected to walk into that hall and find Cedric's hand wrapped around her wrist, had not expected the sudden, overwhelming surge of protectiveness that had carried him across that marble floor before he had even fully decided to move. Now, sitting alone in his study after Alina's carriage had disappeared down the drive, Alexander turned the old scar on his palm over in the firelight and thought about how strange it was that a single night 11 years ago, a night he had spent most of his life trying to bury, had led directly to this one, to a wedding hall full of scandal, to a woman he barely knew but felt, somehow, deeply responsible for. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and Lady Constance entered without waiting for an answer, her expression sharp with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent the last hour managing 200 furious guests. "You have created quite a mess," she said, settling into the chair Alina had occupied only minutes before, her cane resting against her knee. "Half the guests believe you have taken a sudden and scandalous interest in a common seamstress. The other half believe you did it purely to humiliate Cedric out of some old family grievance. Neither version is doing your reputation any favors, Alexander, and you know as well as I do how quickly this family's standing can shift when the wrong story takes hold." "Let them believe whatever version pleases them," Alexander said. "I did not act today for my reputation." "No," Constance said, studying him with the sharp, knowing eyes of a woman who had watched him grow from a grieving boy into a guarded man and had never once been fooled by his careful composure. "You acted today because of William Marsh, did you not? I remember that fire, Alexander. I remember what that man did for you, and I remember how it haunted you afterward, though you never spoke of it to anyone but your father." "You know about the debt," Alexander said, not entirely surprised. Constance had always known more than she let on. "I know enough," she said. "I also know that a debt owed to a dead man's memory is a very different thing from whatever this is turning into. A duke publicly defending his daughter in front of the entire ton, escorting her home himself in your own carriage. People will talk, Alexander, and not always kindly, and I fear the girl will bear the worst of it, not you. You have a title to protect you. She has nothing but a small shop and a good name, and both of those can be destroyed far more easily than you might imagine." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire burn low in the hearth, thinking of Alina's steady voice as she knelt on that marble floor, refusing to let Cedric see how deeply his cruelty had cut, of the quiet dignity with which she had absorbed the shock of learning her father's history within the span of a single conversation. "Then I will make certain she does not bear it alone," he said finally. "Whatever comes of today, Aunt Constance, I do not intend to disappear back into this house and leave her to face the consequences by herself. I have done that for 3 years already, watching from a distance and telling myself it was enough. It is time I did more." Constance studied him for a long moment, something softening slightly in her sharp expression, though her voice remained practical. "Then you had best prepare yourself," she said, "because by morning this will not simply be a story about a ruined wedding. It will be a story about you and about her, and I promise you, Alexander, not everyone in this city will tell that story with kindness." She was, as it turned out, entirely correct. By the following morning, exactly as Lady Constance had warned, the story had spread through every fashionable drawing-room in the city, growing more distorted with each retelling, until the truth of what had happened in that wedding hall was almost impossible to find beneath the layers of invention piled on top of it. Alina heard the first version of it from her neighbor, Margaret Doyle, a kindly older widow who ran the bakery below Alina's small shop, and who arrived at her door before the sun had fully risen, breathless with news she had heard from a fishmonger who had heard it from a lady's maid who worked 2 streets over. "They are saying the Duke of Thornleigh stopped a wedding for you," Margaret said, settling herself into the single chair by Alina's window without waiting for an invitation, the way old friends do. "They are saying all sorts of things, dear. Some say you are his secret ward. Some say you saved his life once and he is finally repaying you. One woman at the market swore up and down that you were engaged to him in secret for years, and Lord Cedric found out, and tried to have you removed from the wedding out of jealousy." Alina, who had barely slept, pressed her palms against her tired eyes and let out a short, disbelieving laugh that held very little humor in it. "None of that is true," she said. "I met him for the first time yesterday, Margaret. I was simply mending a hem." "I know that is not what happened, dear, but knowing the truth has never stopped London from inventing a better story," Margaret said, not unkindly. "You should prepare yourself. People will come by the shop today more than usual, and not all of them will come to buy thread." Margaret's warning proved accurate within the hour. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside Alina's shop window, not customers exactly, but curious onlookers hoping for a glimpse of the woman half the city was suddenly whispering about. Some stared with open curiosity, others with something closer to suspicion. As though Alina's ordinary life had become a puzzle they were determined to solve simply by looking at her hard enough. A few of her regular customers, women who had trusted her with their finest garments for years, sent notes canceling their orders instead of coming in person, unwilling to be associated, even indirectly, with whatever scandal was unfolding around her name. By afternoon, a newspaper had picked up the story, printing a version so exaggerated that Alina barely recognized herself in it, describing her as a mysterious beauty who had bewitched the reclusive Duke of Thornleigh into abandoning years of solitude, hinting, in the careful, deniable language newspapers used when they wished to imply scandal without stating it outright, that there was something improper about a duke escorting an unmarried seamstress home in his private carriage. Alina sat with the paper spread across her small work table that evening, reading the words over and over, feeling something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through her shop windows. She had spent her entire life building a quiet, respectable reputation, one careful stitch and one satisfied customer at a time, and it seemed now that a single afternoon, an afternoon she had not even chosen, could unravel years of careful work in the space of a single printed column. A knock at her door startled her from the thought. She opened it expecting Margaret again, and instead found a young man in fine livery, holding a folded letter sealed with a wax stamp she did not recognize. "A message for Miss Marsh," he said, offering it with a small bow before disappearing back into the darkening street. Alina broke the seal with unsteady hands. The letter was brief, written in a firm, careful hand. "I have heard what the papers are printing, and I am sorry for the part I played in bringing this attention to your door. I did not anticipate how quickly or how unkindly this city would speak of you, and I take full responsibility for underestimating it. If you will permit me, I would like to call on you tomorrow to discuss how best to manage the situation, and to ensure you are not left to bear the consequences of my actions alone. If you would rather I stay away entirely, I will respect that as well, though I hope you will at least allow me the chance to make this right. Alexander Greystone." Alina read the letter twice, then a third time, sitting alone in her small shop as the last light faded from the window, the folded newspaper still spread open on the table beside her, its cruel, inventive words staring up at her in stark black ink. Part of her wanted to write back immediately and tell him to stay away entirely, that his involvement had already cost her more in a single day than she had lost in years of quiet, careful work, that the kindest thing he could do now was disappear back into his enormous house and let the gossip fade on its own. But another part of her, a part she was not entirely comfortable acknowledging, remembered the steadiness in his voice when he had told Cedric to leave her alone, the careful way he had helped her to her feet, the raw honesty in his study as he told her about her father and the fire and the debt he had carried silently for 11 years. She thought of her father's scarred hands, of the man who had risked his life for a stranger and asked for nothing in return, except that his daughter someday be looked after if he could not do it himself. She did not think her father would have wanted her to close her door on the man he had saved, not out of fear of gossip, however painful that gossip might be. Across the city, in a private study that had seen far too many arguments in the past 2 days, Cedric Ashworth sat with a glass of brandy he had refilled more times than he cared to admit, staring at a copy of the same newspaper Alina had read only hours before. His engagement was over. His reputation among the families who mattered most had been badly damaged, not ruined entirely. He still had his title and his fortune, but tarnished in a way that would take considerable effort to repair. And every version of the story he read placed the blame squarely at his own feet, painted him as a cruel, controlling man who had been publicly corrected by his own cousin in front of 200 witnesses. He had spent the entire day receiving quiet, careful visits from friends and acquaintances who wished to know, with poorly disguised curiosity, exactly what had happened and why. He had spent it fielding a furious letter from Sophia's father, demanding compensation for the public embarrassment of a cancelled wedding. He had spent it, above all else, nursing a hatred that had begun as simple anger, and had, over the course of a long, humiliating day, curdled into something colder and more deliberate. "He humiliated me in front of everyone," Cedric said aloud to the empty room, his voice thick with brandy and resentment. "For her, for a seamstress. He chose a nobody over his own family." A knock interrupted his brooding, and his valet entered to announce a visitor, a man named Edmund Price, a solicitor known less for his skill in the courtroom than for his willingness to handle matters other men of business preferred not to touch directly. Cedric had used his services once before, quietly, to settle a dispute involving a debt he did not wish made public. He waved the man in now with a gesture that was not quite steady. "You look as though you have had a difficult few days, my lord," Edmund said, settling into a chair without being invited, his sharp eyes taking in the scattered newspapers, the half-empty brandy bottle, the general disarray of a man whose careful world had come apart at the seams. I have had a difficult few days because my cousin decided to make a spectacle of himself over a seamstress, Cedric said bitterly. I need this handled, Edmund. I need my reputation restored, and I need him to understand exactly what it costs to embarrass me in front of the entire city. Edmund's expression sharpened with the particular attentiveness of a man who scented profitable work ahead. There are ways to handle a situation like this, he said carefully. Reputations, once damaged, can sometimes be repaired more easily by damaging someone else's in return. If the woman's own reputation were to suffer, if certain questions were raised publicly about her relationship with the Duke, about what exactly she might have done to earn his sudden and very public protection, people would begin to wonder whether the fault truly lay with you at all, or whether you were simply the unfortunate victim of a scheming young woman and a Duke too foolish or too infatuated to see through her. Cedric was silent for a long moment, staring into his glass, and something in his expression shifted, hardened, settled into a decision that would prove far more consequential than he yet understood. "Tell me what you would need," he said finally, "to make that story believable." Edmund smiled, the thin, satisfied smile of a man who had just been handed exactly the kind of work he most enjoyed. "Leave that to me, my lord," he said. "By the time I am finished, half of London will believe Miss Marsh planned this entire scandal from the very beginning, and the other half will be too afraid of appearing foolish to argue otherwise." Outside, the evening had fully settled into darkness over the city, and in two very different corners of it, Alina Marsh sat with a letter she had not yet decided how to answer, and Cedric Ashworth sat with a plan he had only just begun to set into motion, both of them unaware of exactly how deeply their futures were about to become entangled with one another, or how much worse this particular storm still had left to give. Alexander arrived at Alina's shop the following afternoon exactly as promised, though he came on foot rather than by carriage, dressed in plain, unremarkable clothes that drew far less attention than his usual fine coats would have. He had learned, over the course of one very long night, that the kindest thing he could do for Alina now was to make himself as inconspicuous as possible, though he suspected it would take considerably more than a plain coat to make a Duke blend into the harbor district. Alina had spent the morning debating whether to let him in at all, and had finally decided, somewhere between her second and third cup of tea, that closing her door to a man who had done nothing but try to help her, however complicated his help had turned out to be, was not the kind of decision her father would have approved of. When the knock came, she opened the door before she could talk herself out of it a second time. "Thank you for allowing me to come," Alexander said, standing awkwardly on her doorstep in a way that seemed strange for a man who commanded entire rooms into silence with 3 words. "I was not certain you would." "I was not certain either," Alina admitted, stepping aside to let him in. Her shop was small, a single room with a work table, shelves of folded fabric, and a narrow staircase leading to the rooms above where she slept, nothing at all like the grand study he had welcomed her into 2 days before, and she felt a brief, sharp awareness of how differently their 2 worlds were built. "But I do not think my father would have wanted me to close my door to the man he pulled out of a burning house, whatever the newspapers are saying about us." Something in Alexander's expression eased slightly at that, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "I read what they printed," he said. "I am sorry, Alina, truly. I did not think through how quickly this city turns curiosity into cruelty, and I should have. I have some experience with it myself, from years ago, though I forgot how sharp it can feel until I watched it land on you instead." "Sit, please," Alina said, gesturing to the small table where she usually worked, and busied her hands with preparing tea, mostly because it gave her something to do besides sit across from him and feel the full, strange weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Tell me honestly, is it going to get worse before it gets better?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with visible care. "I do not know," he admitted. "I have made some inquiries this morning. Cedric has been seen with a solicitor named Edmund Price, a man with a reputation for handling matters other people prefer to keep quiet. I do not yet know what he intends, but I do not trust the timing of it, coming so soon after everything that happened at the wedding. Alina set the teapot down with a slight clatter, her hands not quite as steady as she wanted them to be. "You think he means to hurt me further," she said. It was not quite a question. "I think it is possible," Alexander said honestly. "Cedric does not handle humiliation well. I have known that about him since we were boys. He was never a cruel child, not truly, but he was raised to believe his comfort mattered more than anyone else's feelings, and men raised that way tend to lash out when the world finally tells them otherwise. I would rather warn you and be wrong than say nothing, and watch you be caught unprepared." Alina poured the tea, mostly to steady her own hands, and sat across from him, studying his face in the gray afternoon light filtering through her shop window. "Why did you truly come here today?" she asked. "Not the debt, not my father. I understand all of that now. But there is something else in the way you speak to me, something that does not sound like a man simply repaying an old kindness." Alexander did not answer immediately, and for a moment Alina thought she had overstepped, asked a question he had no intention of answering honestly. Then he set down his own cup and met her eyes directly, the way he had in the wedding hall, the way that made her feel, despite everything, entirely seen. "I have spent 11 years telling myself that watching over you from a distance was enough," he said slowly. "That it honored your father's memory without complicating your life, without dragging you into a world you never asked to be part of. I told myself the same thing again yesterday morning, that I would simply observe from the edge of that wedding hall and ensure you were treated fairly, nothing more. And then I watched Cedric grip your wrist, and something in me simply could not stay at the edge of the room any longer." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly, as though the honesty cost him something to speak aloud. "I do not entirely understand it myself, Alina. I only know that watching you kneel on that floor, humiliated in front of 200 people, felt like something I could not allow to continue, and it was not only because of a debt owed to your father. It was because of you, specifically. I am not certain what to make of that yet, and I do not wish to burden you with more confusion than you are already carrying because of me." Alina sat very still, turning his words over carefully, aware of the fire rising faintly in her own chest, a feeling she did not entirely trust yet, born as it was from 2 days of chaos and revelation rather than any long, steady acquaintance. "That is a great deal to say to someone you have known for 2 days, she said finally, though not unkindly. "I am aware of that," Alexander said, a faint, rueful edge to his voice. "I did not intend to say it at all, if I am honest. It simply came out the way most true things tend to at the worst possible moment." A small, surprised laugh escaped Alina before she could stop it, the first genuine laugh she had allowed herself since the wedding, and something in Alexander's shoulders eased at the sound of it, as though he had been bracing for a very different reaction. "I do not know what to do with any of this," she admitted. 2 days ago my greatest concern was whether I had enough thread to finish an order for a merchant's wife on the east side of the harbor. Now I am sitting across from a duke who has apparently been quietly protecting me for years, who has just told me he feels something for me he cannot fully name, and whose cousin may be plotting to destroy my reputation out of spite. It is rather a lot to absorb before supper." "I understand entirely," Alexander said, and there was warmth in his voice now, something lighter than the careful gravity he had carried since the wedding. "I do not expect anything from you, Alina, beyond honesty. If you would rather I stay at a distance again, the way I have for the past 3 years, I will respect that. But I did not want you to face whatever Cedric is planning without knowing where I stand, or without knowing that you are not facing any of this entirely alone." Alina studied him for a long moment, the steady, careful sincerity in his expression, the same quality that had made her trust him instinctively even in the chaos of the wedding hall, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite certainty, but was perhaps the beginning of it. "I do not want you at a distance," she said finally, surprising herself slightly with how easily the words came. "I think, given everything that has happened, distance would be rather a strange thing to ask for now. But I would like time, Alexander." Time to understand what any of this means, without the entire city deciding the story for us before we have even had the chance to write it ourselves. Time is something I can give you, Alexander said. Protection from Cedric's schemes, unfortunately, may require rather more urgency than that. As if summoned by the words themselves, a sharp knock sounded at Alina's shop door, hard and insistent, nothing like Margaret's familiar tap or the polite knock of a customer. Alina rose to answer it, Alexander close behind her, and found a young boy standing on the step, breathless, clearly having run some distance. "Message for the Duke," the boy said, holding out a folded paper with visible relief at having found his intended recipient so quickly. "I was told to find you here, Your Grace, urgent, from Lady Constance." Alexander broke the seal and read quickly, his expression darkening with each line. "It seems Cedric has already begun," he said grimly, handing the paper to Alina so she could read it herself. "Edmund Price has been seen this morning speaking with 3 separate newspaper editors and with 2 former customers of your shop, Alina. Constance believes they are building a story, something designed to paint you as a woman who deliberately sought my attention for her own gain." Alina read the note twice, her stomach tightening with a cold, familiar dread, the same feeling she had carried reading the newspaper the night before, except sharper now, more deliberate, aimed directly at her instead of simply swirling around her by accident. "What do we do?" she asked, and she was grateful in that moment that her voice came out steadier than she felt. Alexander folded the note carefully, his expression settling into the same calm, deliberate resolve she had seen in the wedding hall 2 days before, the look of a man who had decided, fully and completely, which side of a fight he intended to stand on. "We do not wait for him to finish writing the story before we decide how it ends," he said. "We meet this directly, Alina, together, and we make certain that whatever version of events reaches the public, it is the truth, not whatever poison Cedric and his solicitor intend to spread." Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade toward evening once more, and somewhere across the city, in a private study lit by too many candles and fueled by too much bitterness, Cedric Ashworth was already setting the next piece of his plan into motion, entirely unaware that the 2 people he intended to destroy had just decided, quietly and firmly, to stand against him together. The story broke 3 days later, printed across the front page of a newspaper known more for its willingness to entertain than its commitment to accuracy. It claimed, with careful, deniable phrasing, that Alina Marsh had a history of ingratiating herself with wealthy clients, that 2 former customers had come forward to describe her as manipulative and calculating, that her presence at Cedric Ashworth's wedding had not been the innocent accident it first appeared, but a deliberate arrangement meant to place her directly in the Duke of Thornleigh's path. Alina read it standing at her own work table, her hands going very still over a length of blue silk she had been cutting for an order that, she suspected, would soon be cancelled along with several others. The 2 former customers quoted in the article were women she barely remembered, women whose orders she had completed months ago without incident. Their words twisted now into something unrecognizable, complaints about her character that Alina was certain neither woman had ever actually voiced, not in those terms, not with that particular cruelty. Margaret arrived within the hour, the newspaper already tucked beneath her arm, her face tight with anger on Alina's behalf. "This is filth," she said without preamble, setting the paper down hard enough to rattle the teacups on the table. "Half the harbor knows you, Alina. They know you would never behave the way this rubbish describes. But I fear the fine ladies on the other side of the city do not know you at all, and this is the only version of you they will ever read." "I know," Alina said quietly, and found to her own surprise that she was more angry than afraid, a hot, steady anger that settled into her chest and refused to be talked down. "I have done nothing wrong, Margaret. I mended a hem. I did not ask for any of this." "I know that, dear," Margaret said, softening. "The question now is what you intend to do about it." Alina did not have to wait long to find an answer, because within the hour a carriage arrived outside her shop, and this time it was not Alexander who stepped down from it, but Sophia Vane, dressed simply, without any of the diamonds or fine silk she had worn at the wedding. Her expression set with a determination Alina had not expected to see from a woman she had exchanged barely a dozen words with. "May I come in?" Sophia asked, standing on the doorstep with a copy of the same newspaper clutched in her gloved hand. "I read what they printed about you, and I could not sit at home doing nothing while it happened." Alina stepped aside, curious despite herself, and Sophia entered the small shop with the careful, slightly uncertain movements of a woman unaccustomed to spaces this modest. Though she made no comment on it, no flicker of judgment crossing her face. "I owe you an apology," Sophia said, once they were both seated at Alina's small table. "For not saying more at the wedding, for letting Cedric's cruelty go unanswered for as long as I did before your intervention forced the issue into the open. I have spent 3 years telling myself his temper was simply the cost of a good match, that his family's fortune and standing were worth the occasional cruelty, and I am ashamed now of how long I convinced myself of that." "You do not owe me an apology," Alina said, though she was moved by the sincerity in Sophia's voice. "None of what happened at that wedding was your doing." "Perhaps not directly," Sophia said, "but I know exactly what Cedric is capable of when his pride is wounded, and I fear this newspaper article is only the beginning of what he intends. I came to tell you that I am prepared to speak publicly, to say plainly what I saw and heard during our engagement, if it will help counter whatever lies he is spreading about you now. I have stayed silent about his temper for far too long already, out of fear of the very scandal I am now offering to help create. I would rather use my voice to protect someone else than to protect myself any longer." Alina studied the other woman carefully, surprised by the offer, and by the quiet steel beneath Sophia's composed exterior. "That would cost you a great deal," she said. "Your own reputation would suffer for speaking against a man of his standing." "My reputation has already suffered," Sophia said, with the faint, wry edge of someone who had made peace with a painful truth. "A cancelled wedding does that regardless of who speaks or stays silent. I would rather my reputation suffer for telling the truth than for the silence I have already kept for 3 years. She reached across the table, and with a gentleness Alina had not expected, covered her hand briefly with her own. "You showed more courage kneeling on that floor, refusing to let him see you break, than I showed in 3 years of quietly accepting his temper. The least I can do now is stand beside you while you face what comes next." Word of the newspaper article reached Alexander within the hour as well, carried by a servant who found him in the middle of a heated conversation with Lady Constance about the very same subject. He read the piece twice, his jaw tightening with each pass, before folding it and setting it aside with careful, deliberate calm that did not entirely mask the anger simmering beneath it. "This cannot go unanswered," he said. "If we allow this story to stand unchallenged, it will follow Alina for years, regardless of what actually happened. I intend to respond publicly, Aunt Constance, and I would like your counsel on how best to do it without making the situation worse." "You could simply say nothing," Constance said, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe her own suggestion. "Silence sometimes lets scandal burn itself out faster than argument does." "Silence, in this case, is the same as agreement," Alexander said. "I will not let a lie about her character stand simply because contradicting it is inconvenient for me. She has already paid too high a price for a moment of decency I chose to act on. I will not let her pay for my silence as well." Constance studied her nephew for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her sharp features. "You care for her a great deal," she said, not quite a question. "I do," Alexander said simply, without hesitation, as though the admission cost him nothing at all now that he had already spoken it once, to Alina herself, 3 days before. "More than I expected to, given how little time has passed since we met. I am aware of how that sounds, Aunt Constance, but I have learned this past week that some truths do not require years to become certain, only the right circumstances to reveal them clearly." Constance's expression softened, the sharpness giving way to something gentler, more genuinely warm than Alexander had seen from her in some time. "Then you had best act quickly," she said. And you had best act carefully, because Edmund Price does not strike me as a man who gives up his schemes easily once he has begun them, and Cedric's pride is wounded badly enough now that I do not think this newspaper article will be his final move. Constance's instincts proved correct within days. A second article appeared, this one more pointed than the first, hinting that Alina had once been involved in a dispute over stolen fabric with a former employer. A claim entirely fabricated but difficult to disprove quickly, given how deliberately Edmund Price had chosen a former employer who had since moved away from the city and could not easily be located to confirm or deny the story. Alina's remaining customers, already nervous from the first article, began canceling their orders in earnest now, unwilling to risk their own reputations by association with a woman accused, however falsely, of dishonesty. Alina sat in her shop late one evening, surrounded by half-finished orders that would likely never be collected, the accumulated weight of a week's worth of scandal pressing down on her in a way that made even simple tasks, threading a needle, folding a length of cloth, feel exhausting beyond measure. Alexander found her there, having let himself in with the spare key she had given him only 2 days before, a small, quiet gesture of trust that had meant more to both of them than either had said aloud. "I do not know how much more of this I can bear," Alina admitted, her voice quiet in the dim light of her single candle. "It is not the lies themselves that frighten me. It is how easily people believe them, how quickly years of honest work can be erased by a few careless words printed in ink." Alexander sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, a small, steadying warmth in the middle of a difficult night. "I am not going to let this continue unanswered," he said. "Sophia has offered to speak publicly about Cedric's temper. Constance has agreed to host an event, a gathering large enough that half the city's most influential families will attend, where the truth can be spoken plainly, in a setting no newspaper can easily distort afterward. I intend for Cedric to answer for what he has done, Alina, in front of the very people whose opinion he values most. I am done allowing him to operate in shadows, while you bear the consequences in daylight." Alina turned to look at him, exhaustion and gratitude and something warmer still mingling in her expression. "You would do all of that for me," she said softly, "after everything this has already cost you." "I would do far more than that," Alexander said, "and it costs me nothing compared to what it has already cost you." He reached over gently and covered her hand with his own, the same gesture Sophia had offered her days before, though it carried between them a warmth that went beyond simple solidarity. "I told you once that I did not entirely understand what I felt for you that first day in my study. I understand it a great deal better now, Alina, and I do not intend to let Cedric's cruelty be the thing that decides how this story ends for either of us." Outside, the city continued to whisper and speculate. Newspapers continued to print half-truths dressed up as fact. And in a grand house across town, Cedric Ashworth continued to believe, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once faced real consequences for his actions, that he still held the upper hand in a war he did not yet realize he was already beginning to lose. Lady Constance's charity gala had, for over a decade, been one of the most anticipated events of the winter season, held each year in the grand ballroom of her own townhouse, and attended by nearly every family of consequence in the city. This year, word had spread quickly that the Duke of Thornleigh intended to attend in person, his first appearance at such a public event since the wedding scandal 3 weeks before, and the invitations, already prized, became something close to essential, every family eager to witness firsthand whatever fresh drama the evening might bring. Alina stood in front of a small mirror in a modest room Lady Constance had set aside for her, smoothing the front of a deep green gown that Sophia had insisted on having made for her, over Alina's protests that she did not need such finery, that a simple dress would suit her better among a crowd that already viewed her with suspicion. "You will not walk into that ballroom looking as though you are apologizing for your presence," Sophia had said firmly, standing over the dressmaker's shoulder as the final adjustments were made. "You will walk in looking exactly like a woman who has done nothing wrong, because that is precisely what you are." Now, staring at her own reflection, Alina felt her nerves rising steadily, a tight, fluttering anxiety that had nothing to do with the gown and everything to do with what waited beyond the door. Cedric had been invited, as had every other family of consequence, and Alexander had made no secret of his intention to address the rumors directly tonight, in front of witnesses who could not later claim to have misunderstood or misremembered what was said. "You look beautiful," Sophia said, appearing in the doorway, her own gown a deep blue that suited her far better than the white silk she had worn to her almost wedding. "And more importantly, you look steady. That matters more tonight than beauty does." "I do not feel steady," Alina admitted. "None of us do when it matters," Sophia said, offering her arm. "Come, let us face this together." The ballroom, when they entered it, was already crowded, candlelight glittering off jewels and polished floors, the low hum of conversation and music filling the enormous space. Alina felt the shift the moment their arrival was noticed. Heads turning, whispers rising, the same particular attention she had grown painfully familiar with over the past 3 weeks, though tonight she found she could meet it more steadily than before, buoyed by Sophia's arm linked through her own, and the knowledge that Alexander would be somewhere in this crowd as well. She found him near the center of the room, speaking with a small cluster of guests, and the moment his eyes found hers across the crowded floor, something in his expression eased, the tension he had clearly been carrying all evening softening into quiet relief. He excused himself and crossed to her side, taking her hand with a formality that did not entirely disguise the warmth beneath it. "You came," he said. "I was not certain you would, after everything." "I told you once I was not afraid of gossip," Alina said. "I find that is still true, even now, even with the entire room watching us." They had barely exchanged another word before Cedric arrived, flanked by Edmund Price, his expression carrying the particular brittle confidence of a man who had convinced himself, through weeks of careful scheming, that tonight would be the night he finally reclaimed the upper hand. He approached with deliberate slowness, ensuring as many guests as possible noticed his arrival, and stopped a few feet from where Alina and Alexander stood. "I did not expect you to bring her here tonight," Cedric said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearby guests, who had already begun drifting closer, sensing, with the particular hunger of people who loved a scandal, that something significant was about to unfold. "Given everything the newspapers have printed about her character, I would have thought you might wish to distance yourself a little, cousin, for the sake of your own standing." "The newspapers printed lies, Cedric," Alexander said, his voice calm but carrying easily through the growing hush around them. "Lies that you and your solicitor arranged to have printed. I would think you might be more concerned with your own standing tonight, given how thoroughly I intend to correct the record." A murmur rippled through the crowd, guests turning fully now, abandoning any pretense of polite disinterest. Cedric's composure flickered just slightly before he recovered it. "That is a serious accusation," he said, "one you cannot prove." "Can I not?" Alexander said, and there was something in his tone now, quiet and utterly certain, that made even Cedric's confidence waver further. "Edmund Price visited 3 newspaper editors in the space of a single week, all of whom happened to owe considerable debts to your family. Debts I have since learned were quietly forgiven the same week these articles about Alina were printed. I have the records, Cedric, obtained quite legally, showing the timing of those forgiven debts against the publication dates of every article. I did not come here tonight to make an accusation I could not support." The murmur around them grew louder, guests exchanging quick, startled glances, several already beginning to whisper the details to friends who had arrived too late to hear the exchange firsthand. Edmund Price, standing at Cedric's side, had gone visibly pale, his earlier confidence entirely gone. "This is absurd," Cedric said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. "You would take her word over mine, over the word of your own family, for a seamstress you have known barely 3 weeks. I would take the truth over a lie, regardless of who tells it," Alexander said. "And the truth, Cedric, is that you humiliated a woman for a minor mistake in front of your entire wedding party, that your own bride left you at the altar because she finally saw clearly what kind of man you are, and that rather than accepting the consequences of your own cruelty, you chose to punish an innocent woman further simply because your pride could not tolerate being corrected in public. He paused, letting the words settle fully over the silent room before continuing. I do not say this to humiliate you as you humiliated her, though I understand if it feels that way. I say it because Alina has spent 3 weeks losing customers, enduring public suspicion, and defending her own good name against lies you paid to have printed. And I will not stand by and allow that injustice to continue simply because addressing it plainly is uncomfortable for you. Sophia stepped forward then, her voice clear and steady despite the weight of every eye in the ballroom turning toward her. I can confirm everything the Duke has said, she said. I was engaged to Lord Cedric for nearly a year. I witnessed his temper firsthand on more occasions than I care to count, though I stayed silent about it out of fear of the very scandal I am choosing to speak into now. I regret that silence deeply. I do not intend to stay silent any longer. A long, heavy pause settled over the ballroom, broken finally by an older gentleman near the front. A man Alina recognized vaguely as one of the city's most respected magistrates, who stepped forward with the deliberate authority of someone accustomed to weighing evidence carefully before rendering judgment. If what has been said tonight can be substantiated, he said, addressing Alexander directly, I would expect a formal correction printed in every paper that carried these accusations, and I would expect Lord Ashworth to answer for whatever role he played in arranging them, through whatever legal means are appropriate. Cedric looked around the ballroom then, at faces that had, only weeks before, admired and courted his favor, now regarding him instead with open disgust and disapproval, and something in his expression finally cracked entirely, the careful mask of confidence giving way to raw, cornered fury. You have all made your judgment already, he said, his voice rising bitter and unsteady. It hardly matters what I say now. It matters a great deal what you do next, Alexander said quietly. Whether you accept responsibility or whether you continue trying to escape it, that choice at least is still entirely yours. Cedric said nothing further. He turned, pushed his way through the crowd that parted for him now not out of respect, but out of the same instinct that made people step back from something unpleasant, and left the ballroom with Edmund Price hurrying uncertainly behind him, the two of them disappearing into the cold night air, their scheme unraveled entirely in the space of a single confrontation. The ballroom remained quiet for a long moment after the door closed behind them, and then, slowly, conversation began to rise again, different now than before, guests turning to Alina with expressions that had shifted, gradually but unmistakably, from suspicion to something closer to sympathy and respect. An older woman Alina did not recognize approached first, offering a quiet apology for believing the newspaper articles so readily, and others followed, a slow but steady tide of guests eager, in the particular way of society, to align themselves now with the version of events that had proven true rather than the one that had proven false. Alina stood in the middle of it, Alexander's hand still resting warm and steady over hers, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight and guarded for 3 long weeks, a slow, cautious relief settling in where fear had lived for far too long. It is not entirely over, Alexander said quietly, close enough that only she could hear him over the rising noise of the ballroom. Cedric will likely face consequences for what he arranged, and there will be more talk before this fully settles. But I do not think anyone in this room will doubt your character again, not after tonight. Thank you, Alina said softly, turning to look at him fully, the candlelight catching the warmth in his expression, warmth that had nothing to do with public spectacle and everything to do with the quiet, steady regard that had grown steadily between them over 3 difficult weeks. For tonight, and for everything before it. You do not need to thank me, Alexander said, echoing the words he had spoken to her that very first day, though they carried a different weight now, softened by everything that had passed between them since. I only wish I had done more sooner to spare you the worst of it. You did exactly what needed doing, Alina said, when it needed doing. That is more than most people manage in an entire lifetime. Around them, the gala continued, music rising once more to fill the enormous room, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Alina allowed herself to simply stand still in the middle of it, unafraid of the eyes upon her, steady beside a man who had walked into a wedding hall uninvited and changed the entire course of her life, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was grateful for every strange, difficult turn that had led her to this exact moment. In the weeks that followed the gala, the consequences Alexander had promised arrived steadily, one after another, until the life Cedric Ashworth had once taken entirely for granted began to unravel in ways even he had not anticipated. The magistrate who had spoken up that night pursued the matter formally, and within a month, 3 separate newspapers printed careful, public corrections, admitting that the articles concerning Alina Marsh had been based on false information provided under financial incentive, though none of them named Cedric directly, the law being far more cautious than gossip ever was. It did not matter. Everyone who mattered already knew the truth, and in a city built as much on reputation as on money, that was often punishment enough. Edmund Price disappeared from fashionable circles entirely, his reputation as a solicitor too damaged by association with the scandal to attract further clients of consequence, and within a year he had left the city altogether, seeking work in a smaller town where his name did not yet carry the weight of scandal. Cedric fared little better. Invitations that had once arrived by the dozen slowed to a trickle, then stopped almost entirely. Families who had once courted an alliance with the Ashworth name found reasons, polite but firm, to distance themselves, unwilling to risk their daughters' reputations by association with a man now widely known for both cruelty and deceit. He retreated eventually to a smaller property his family owned in the countryside, far from London's drawing rooms, and Alina heard, occasionally, second-hand reports of a man grown quieter and more solitary, though whether from genuine remorse or simple defeat, she could not say, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not particularly wish to know. Sophia Vane, meanwhile, found in the aftermath of her cancelled wedding a freedom she had not expected. Released from an engagement that had, in truth, brought her little happiness even before its dramatic end, she used the settlement her family negotiated with the Ashworths to establish herself independently, taking a small house of her own near the edge of the fashionable district, and to the quiet astonishment of several older relatives, beginning to involve herself in charitable work supporting young women who had left difficult domestic situations, work she pursued with a quiet, steady passion that suggested she had finally found something worth building her own life around, rather than simply waiting to be chosen by someone else's. She and Alina remained close in the months that followed, an unlikely friendship forged in scandal, but sustained by genuine warmth, the 2 women meeting regularly for tea, Sophia often bringing young women from her charitable work to Alina's shop for new dresses, work that helped Alina's business recover and grow steadily beyond what it had ever been before the wedding, her reputation now carrying not the stain of scandal, but the shine of having weathered it with dignity and tact. Alina's shop, in fact, flourished in ways she could scarcely have imagined during those difficult weeks of gossip and cancelled orders. Word had spread, alongside the corrected newspaper articles, of her quiet strength throughout the entire ordeal, and customers who had once hesitated now sought her out specifically, curious to meet the woman who had, in the words of one particularly enthusiastic client, stood her ground against a lord and come away with her honor entirely intact. Alina found the attention strange at first, uncomfortable even, accustomed as she was to quiet, unremarkable work, but she settled into it gradually, grateful simply that her skill, rather than the scandal, was what ultimately kept her customers returning. Alexander, for his part, found himself changing in ways that surprised even those who had known him longest. The reclusive duke who had avoided society for years, who had carried the guilt of a debt unpaid like a private wound he preferred no one examine too closely, began appearing more frequently at public gatherings, not out of any particular love for society itself, but because Alina, increasingly, was beside him at these events, and her presence made rooms he had once found exhausting feel instead worth attending. Lady Constance, watching this transformation with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent years worrying over her nephew's isolation, remarked more than once that she had not seen him laugh so easily since before the fire that had first bound his fate to William Marsh's family so many years ago. It was on a quiet evening in early spring, nearly 6 months after that chaotic wedding day, that Alexander finally asked Alina to walk with him through the gardens at Thornleigh Hall, the same gardens Alina had glimpsed once through a window, gray and bare with winter, now blooming steadily with the first flowers of the season. They walked slowly along a path lined with new green growth, the evening air mild and fragrant, and Alina found herself thinking, not for the first time, how strange and unlikely it was that a single humiliating afternoon had led her here, to this garden, walking beside a man who had once been a stranger and had become, gradually and then all at once, someone she could not imagine her life without. "I have been thinking," Alexander said, as they paused near a small stone bench overlooking a quiet pond, "about the promise your father asked of my own father all those years ago. Look after my daughter someday if I am ever not able to. I have spent 11 years trying to understand what that promise truly meant, and I think, for a long time, I misunderstood it entirely. I thought it meant simply ensuring you were provided for, safe, comfortable, watched over from a careful distance. I do not think that is what he meant at all, not truly." "What do you think he meant?" Alina asked softly, watching him with the particular attentiveness she had learned, over months, to recognize as the moment before he said something that mattered a great deal to him. "I think he meant that whoever looked after you should do it properly," Alexander said, turning to face her fully, something vulnerable and entirely sincere in his expression, a rare openness she had come to treasure precisely because it came to him so rarely and cost him so much to offer. Not from a distance, not through quiet, careful arrangements meant to remain unseen, but directly, honestly, with his whole attention and his whole heart. "I do not think your father wanted me to simply keep you safe, Alina. I think he wanted, whether he knew it or not, for whoever eventually loved you to love you completely, the way he loved your mother, the way he loved you." Alina's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet of the garden settling comfortably around them, broken only by the soft sound of water moving gently in the pond beside them. "I love you," Alexander said, simply and directly, the words carrying none of the careful hesitation he had shown that first afternoon in his study, only quiet, steady certainty, the kind that comes only after months of proving itself through action rather than words alone. "I have loved you, I think, for longer than I have been willing to admit fully to myself, certainly since long before tonight. I do not say this because of any debt owed to your father, though I will always be grateful to him, always carry what he did for me as one of the great gifts of my life. I say it because you are the bravest, most steady person I have ever known, and because every single day since that wedding, my life has felt fuller simply for having you in it." Alina felt tears gathering, warm and unexpected, though they were nothing like the tears she had held back that first terrible afternoon kneeling on Thornleigh Hall's marble floor. These tears came from somewhere entirely different, somewhere full rather than empty, and she found she did not want to hold them back at all. "I love you too," she said, her voice steady despite the tears, because she had learned over the course of this strange, difficult, wonderful year that steadiness and emotion were not opposites at all, that her father had taught her to keep her hands steady even when her chest was not, but he had never taught her that her chest needed to stay closed as well. "I did not expect any of this, Alexander. Not the wedding, not the scandal, not any of it. But I would not undo a single part of it, difficult as it was, because it led me here to this garden to you." Alexander reached into his coat then, and produced a small ring, simple compared to the elaborate diamonds Alina had once seen on Sophia's finger, but beautiful in its own quiet way, a single deep green stone set carefully in gold. "This was my mother's," he said, "one of the few things of hers that survived the fire, kept safe in a box that did not burn. I have carried it for years, uncertain whether I would ever find someone I wished to give it to. I find now that I cannot imagine giving it to anyone but you." Alina looked down at the ring, then up at Alexander's face, at the careful hope written plainly across features that had, only 6 months ago, seemed so guarded and distant to her, and felt the last of her uncertainty settle finally into something clear and unshakable. "Yes," she said, before he had even fully finished asking the question that hung, unspoken but unmistakable in the quiet evening air between them. "Yes, Alexander. I will marry you." The garden seemed to hold its breath around them for a moment, much as the wedding hall had held its breath 6 months before, though this silence carried none of the tension of that first terrible afternoon, only quiet, complete joy. The kind that needed no crowd of witnesses to make it real, only the two of them, standing together in the fading evening light, finally, fully, choosing each other. News of their engagement spread through the city within days, though this time the whispers carried warmth rather than scandal, the entire fashionable world seeming to agree, with the particular fickleness of society, that this was precisely the ending their story deserved. The reclusive duke and the seamstress who had weathered a storm of gossip and emerged not diminished but strengthened, their bond forged in adversity rather than convenience. Even those who had once believed the lies printed about Alina found themselves, in the months leading up to the wedding, eager to offer congratulations, to claim, quietly, that they had always suspected the truth would win out eventually. Alina did not need their approval, had learned, over the difficult months since that terrible wedding, that her own steady sense of herself mattered a great deal more than the shifting opinions of a crowd too easily swayed by whichever story was told loudest. But she found, all the same, a quiet satisfaction in watching the same city that had once so readily believed the worst of her now gather, eagerly, to celebrate the best. Their own wedding, when it finally arrived on a bright morning in early summer, bore little resemblance to the chaotic afternoon that had first brought them together. It was held not in the grand marble hall where Cedric's wedding had collapsed into scandal, but in the very garden where Alexander had proposed, small and intimate, attended only by those who had truly stood beside them through the difficult months before. Margaret Doyle, sitting proudly near the front in her finest dress, Sophia serving as Alina's only attendant, Lady Constance watching with unabashed tears in her eyes as her nephew, once so guarded and solitary, finally found the happiness she had long feared he might never allow himself. Alina wore a gown of her own design, simple and elegant, without any of the elaborate finery that had once caused her such trouble at another wedding entirely. And as she walked toward Alexander beneath a canopy of early summer roses, she thought of her father, of his scarred hands and his quiet insistence that she build her own life, of the debt he had never wanted repaid in coin, but had in the end been repaid in something far more valuable, the steady, complete devotion of the man he had once pulled from a burning building, now offering that same devotion, freely and completely, to his daughter. "I think he would have liked you very much," Alina said quietly to Alexander, as they stood together beneath the roses, waiting for the small ceremony to begin. "My father. I think he would have been glad to know his debt was repaid this way." "I hope so," Alexander said, taking her hands in his, the old scar on his palm pressed gently against her fingers, a permanent reminder of the fire that had, in its own strange and roundabout way, brought them together across 11 years and one chaotic wedding day. "I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of it." And as the small gathering of loved ones looked on, and the summer sun warmed the garden around them, Alina Marsh, once a quiet seamstress kneeling humiliated on a marble floor, became Alina Greystone, Duchess of Thornleigh, standing not as a woman rescued by circumstance, but as one who had, through her own steady courage, helped write the ending to a story that had begun, so unexpectedly, with 3 simple words spoken across a silent wedding hall. 3 years later, Alina stood once again in a hallway lined with portraits of Alexander's ancestors, though this time she did not walk it as a nervous visitor uncertain of her welcome, but as the woman whose own portrait now hung among them, painted the previous winter at Constance's insistent urging, showing Alina not in elaborate jewels but in a simple gown of deep green, a length of fabric and a needle resting in her lap, a small, deliberate nod to the life she had built long before any title had been added to her name. Her shop still stood in the harbor district, though she visited it now only a few times each month, having handed the daily running of it to two young women she had trained herself, women who reminded her, in their quiet determination, of who she had once been. She had insisted on keeping it open rather than closing it entirely when she married, unwilling to let go of the work that had shaped her long before Alexander Greystone ever walked into that wedding hall. And Alexander had never once suggested otherwise, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, how much of who Alina was lived in the steady, careful rhythm of needle and thread. Margaret still ran her bakery below the shop, though she had grown rather fond, over the years, of boasting to her customers about her connection to the Duchess of Thornleigh, a boast Alina tolerated with fond, amused patience, knowing how much genuine warmth lived beneath Margaret's teasing pride. Sophia had, the previous spring, married a quiet, kind physician she had met through her charitable work, a match built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than family fortune, and she often remarked, with a small, private smile, that she owed her own happiness in some strange way to the very scandal that had once threatened to ruin her. Cedric remained in the countryside, largely forgotten by the society that had once courted him so eagerly, though word occasionally reached the city that he had grown quieter, more reflective, that whatever bitterness had once consumed him had, over the slow passage of years, given way to something closer to genuine regret. Alina did not think of him often, had found, somewhere in the years since that chaotic afternoon, that she no longer carried any anger toward him at all, only a distant, faintly sorrowful understanding of a man who had let his pride cost him nearly everything worth having. Alexander, meanwhile, had become, to the quiet astonishment of nearly everyone who had known him before that fateful wedding, one of the most engaged and well-regarded dukes in the city, his estate known now not for its reclusive master, but for its careful, generous management, for the fair wages paid to its workers, and the scholarships it funded for children of the harbor district who showed promise but lacked means, a program Alina had suggested and helped design, remembering always her own father's quiet dignity and the value of honest work fairly rewarded. On a warm evening in late summer, Alina sat in the same garden where Alexander had once proposed, now grown fuller and more established with 3 years of careful tending, watching her husband walk slowly along the path with their young daughter perched happily on his shoulders, her small hands tangled in his dark hair, her laughter carrying bright and clear across the quiet evening air. They had named her Grace, after no one in particular, simply because it was a word that felt, to both of them, like an accurate description of everything that had carried them through the difficult early days of their story into the steady happiness they now shared. "She is going to fall asleep before we even reach the pond," Alina called out, smiling, as Alexander approached, Grace's small head already beginning to droop against his shoulder despite her earlier laughter. "She takes after her mother," Alexander said, settling onto the bench beside Alina with practiced care, careful not to jostle their sleeping daughter. "Steady, even in exhaustion." Alina laughed softly, reaching over to smooth a strand of dark hair away from Grace's small face. "I still think of that day sometimes," she admitted, "the wedding, all of it. It feels like a different life entirely, though I know it was only the beginning of this one." "Do you regret any of it?" Alexander asked, watching her carefully, the same careful attentiveness he had shown her from that very first day, though it carried, now, none of the uncertainty it once had. "Not a moment," Alina said honestly. "Even the difficult parts, the gossip, the fear, all of it. I think I needed to walk through that storm to understand exactly what I was building on the other side of it. My father used to tell me that a person's true character shows most clearly not in comfort but in difficulty. I did not fully understand what he meant until I knelt on that marble floor and had to decide, in that moment, whether I would let Cedric's cruelty define me, or whether I would simply keep my hands steady and trust that the truth would eventually win out." "It did win out," Alexander said quietly, "though I do not think it happened entirely on its own. You fought for it, Alina, every difficult step of the way." "We fought for it together," Alina corrected gently, resting her head against his shoulder as the evening light softened around them, gold and warm across the garden they had built their life within. That has always been the difference, I think, between what happened that day and everything that came after. That first day, I was alone, kneeling on a cold floor with no one willing to stand beside me until you walked through that door. Every day since, I have never had to face anything alone again. Alexander pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, careful not to disturb their sleeping daughter between them, and together they sat in comfortable, contented silence as the last light of evening settled over Thornleigh Hall, over the garden where their story had truly begun, over the quiet, steady life they had built from the wreckage of a wedding that had, against every expectation, led not to ruin, but to exactly the kind of ending Alina's father might have hoped for, all those years ago, when he asked nothing more of a grateful young duke than that his daughter someday be looked after with a whole and honest heart. And somewhere in the fading light, the old debt between two families, born in fire and carried silently for over a decade, finally rested easy. Not because it had been repaid in any way William Marsh could have imagined that terrible night, but because it had grown, quietly and completely, into something far more valuable than repayment had ever needed to be. A lasting, steady love built not on obligation, but on choice, renewed freely every single day by two people who had once been strangers kneeling and standing on opposite sides of a silent, stunned wedding hall, and who had found in each other a home neither of them had known they were searching for.